Woods gold standard. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard, as the Ainslie Group celebrates 50 years. Today, we welcome back Alex, who's been looking at the 80-year anniversary of the Bretton Woods Agreement as a key defining moment in the transformation of the global economy into what it is as we know it today. It raises the obvious questions about what we've learned over that time, and are we on the brink of a new system going to emerge to replace the old? Lots of interesting things to discuss. How are you going today, Alex?
I'm going well, very well rested, sort of, after the holidays.
That's the problem with holidays, isn't it? You sort of get into that holiday zone, and then you got to come back to work and back into the markets and paying attention to it all. So it kicks you back into gear. It's all fun and games.
Yes, too many
So
games and fun.
So you look today. I actually like the angle you took today to sort of ease back into the year, where you're going back in a little bit of history and looking at something that is quite important, which is that Bretton Woods system. So I thought probably to start us off, it'd be good if you could give us maybe a bit of a primer on what Bretton Woods is, or what it was back in those days, how Keynesian economics or Keynes, the economist, sort of fits into that story, and how the gold standard sort of fits into that as well.
Okay, so I guess the reason we've sort of done this article is this week is Davos as well. So we've got all the people that, all the countries and all the academics and economists and business leaders have in Davos this week talking about the future of the world economy. And it comes back to 80 years ago. This was going on again in an election year, 1944, coming to the end of World War II, coming out of the Great Depression. What are we going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? So Maynard Keynes was the economist in the UK who basically encouraged fiscal spending. So you've got Keynesian economics, and then you've got Austrian sort of monetary economics. So he's the fiscal guy that talks about government spending to get, if the economy is too hot, pull the spending back. If the economy is slowing down, like during the Depression, government should start spending, which went a lot against what the theory was before then, which was if governments don't have money, you can't spend it, which we all know now is a runaway train, and they've taken it well past the point of return.
Yes, we've certainly stretched that concept to extremes today, haven't we?
To maximum size. At $88 trillion of government debt in the world right now, 34 trillion of that the US. So going back to 1944, when the US had money and had the ability to lend it to other countries to, have a post-war boom. So that kind of was the golden era of world economics. So from about 1950 to about 1970, everything was running beautifully. 1944, we had Maynard Keynes and a guy called Harry Dexter White, who was an economist in the US, start talking about what they could do to fix everything. We want America to start lending to people. Let's set up a World Bank, and let's go back to some sort of gold standard. What's interesting about the gold standard, and I've spoken about this about the gold standard that came out of Bretton Woods before, but what I hadn't realized was that what was going on during that meeting was you had two superpowers. You had the United Kingdom, which is, just coming out of a war. They're battered, they're bruised. They've led the country out of austerity with Keynes, and they're doing pretty well. But you've got the new money in the US, where their economy's booming. They came late into the war. They've lent money. They've had a huge war economy without the same losses that Europe had. So they're coming out of it, and they've got money to spend. So their influence actually became a lot more than Keynes. So there's all this stuff about how the Bretton Woods was based on fiscal Keynesian policies. But what was interesting reading is Harry Dexter White snuck a word in, which was gold and US dollar. So the actual Bretton Woods Agreement was not a true gold standard. It was a hybrid of both gold and US dollar. And Maynard Keynes, after the meeting, has admitted that he didn't read the fine detail, and it got past him. So to say that the influence was all Keynesian is not correct. There was a lot of US economics behind it, and a US power play versus the UK power play at that point in time.
That's fascinating because I didn't know that piece of information, and we often attribute these things to Keynes, and maybe unfairly.
Seems like it, and in fact, it wasn't sort of until about 1959, I believe, when it sort of started to unravel, that the damage that was done with the gold and US dollar was really seen with what was called the Triffin paradox. So this economist in the US basically said, what's going on is the world economy is growing and it's growing really well, but we've got a hybrid, I guess, gold and US standard. And what actually started happening was, you can only grow gold at the rate that you can pull it out of the ground and you can find it. But as we know, when you're the reserve currency, you can grow it much faster. So because we had this hybrid gold standard, what was actually going on was all the countries were growing US dollar reserves. They were meant to be able to buy gold from the US at an equivalent $35 US per ounce. That stayed the same amount. It wasn't changing, but the amount of US dollars was changing at a rate faster than gold was being produced. So these countries would actually lend the US dollars back to the US. The US would therefore be required to buy more gold, and there just wasn't the gold to buy. So basically US dollar, there were more and more US dollars being created and a much bigger liability being created for the US that they just couldn't keep up with. So that was known as the Triffin paradox. And ultimately it led to the collapse of the gold standard known as Bretton Woods, because these countries started arbitraging the fact that there was little gold and lots of US dollars.
And we know sort of what happened after that. They just abandoned that completely, and now we've ever since been on that sort of fiat only standard. Like, there's probably a lot to answer for those institutions surrounding Bretton Woods there. Like, who are the main players there?
Well, you've got the the IMF, and
Yep.
then you've got the World Bank. So they were basically charged initially with helping lend money cheaply to countries that needed it to recover from the war and the Great Depression. And Maynard Keynes's main philosophy with fiscal was, if someone's doing it tough, give them cheap money, let them put it back into the economy and let them grow the economy. So again, that was working really well through the sort of 50s and 60s. And then in the 70s, when we moved to the petrodollar and Thatcher came in power, there was a lot more influence through these institutions from Western countries. Sorry, there was always that influence, but it was more, they started pushing austerity. We'll lend you money if. We'll lend you money if your government cuts spending here. So they actually became anti-Keynesian. Like, they actually were doing exactly what they were not set up to do.
Yep.
And what's very interesting is, again, in the article, there's a thing from a seminar in Africa at the moment where they talk about Bretton Woods institutions being Western and how they've worked against developing countries ever since they were set up. Now, I'd argue not ever since they were set up. I'd argue ever since the influence became more about austerity and more about what they were never set up to do.
Yep. That makes sense.
So there's a lot of anger from these BRICS countries that do not and have not in the past had the same influence on the IMF and World Bank, that they've been unfairly, in economics, they've been unfairly targeted since the Bretton Woods Agreement.
So this leads to the discussion we've had around the BRICS and this idea that potentially they wanted to look at having another, reiterating a gold standard in some form. Do you think that's even possible today, or what would that look like today? Because it seems like with the state that we're in, it's not really a viable solution. I know a lot of people would argue that we need to return to some sort of austerity, and certainly we're off the deep end in terms of the opposite of that, where we're just printing money out of control. But how do you interpret that?
There just aren't the gold reserves in the world right now to back a full backing of all financial systems with gold. Other possibilities, of course, of Bitcoin, and then possibly, you look at a basket of commodities, possibly, or a basket
And
of
that
other
was
goods.
part of, from what you write in the article, that was part of what the original plan was anyway. It wasn't necessarily to lock it to one thing, was it?
The Bretton Woods was, well, I mean, I guess that's why they expanded it to the US dollar. But to tie it to one currency only, as we know, like the US has gone from basically the biggest lender in the world to the biggest borrower in the world in that period of time. And it's run away. And I mean, what's interesting, I guess, is if you sort of look back to then, compared to now, the US wasn't going to every war. They came in at the end. They had money at the end of the war. I think they produced something like 50% of manufactured goods at that. Like, they were a huge superpower. And 80 years on, they've lost all of that, and yet their markets continue to outperform every other financial market in the world. So, it's become like a crazy differential, I think, to where they actually wanted to be when that agreement was first set up.
And people make this analysis saying currencies or regimes don't last forever. They have a lifespan. We've probably beyond the lifespan of this one. That kind of makes sense based on what you just said. When you think about it, the situation changes over time, and we've certainly in a very different world today to what we were 80 years ago. So it makes sense that we're potentially at that period of time where something new needs to emerge anyway.
I mean, the US dollar interest expenditure now outstrips its defense budget. Like, it's gotten out of hand, and no one seems to want to fix it, and nobody knows how to fix it. And it is tied to the fact that there is one reserve currency and one deep financial market, and the rest of the world hasn't developed at the same rate.
Well, we don't have any solutions today, but we, as always, it's fascinating to at least identify what the problem is. So, thank you for your work on that again today, Alex, and bringing us that little bit more insight and history there, because it really does help us to frame the bigger issues that we're going to be tackling over this year, because I'm sure there are plenty ahead. So, thank you for that.
It'll be an interesting year.
It most certainly will be. Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll chat again soon.